Okay, guys, this is one of the longer units. I love civil rights. I cover every area of civil rights that I can, but I always find that it is just a unit that does me in. It's an exhausting unit because you have so many things to cover, and because you're having to remind the students again that this is all taking place during those other units that we just went over. Okay, so having a running timeline that is covering everything by era, and then adding Cold War on top of it to show that where the Cold War spans, and then adding your other wars like Korean War, Vietnam War, adding those things in so the students see these are taking place during this era, during this time frame, during these decades. This is going to help them, okay, better visualize that these are going on at the same time. Okay, we're going to start with 9G. Describe presidential actions and congressional votes to address minority rights in the United States, including desegregation of the armed forces, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So you can see that I had mentioned the desegregation of armed forces when we were talking about Truman. So that was right after World War II, and here we are. We've gone through two other units, and now we're back over here, right? It's like we're backtracking. Really, I think that civil rights should probably come before early Cold War and Vietnam if we're going to focus, or early Cold War, civil rights, and then Vietnam. This is how Lead Forward has it set up. Maybe we can talk about maybe flipping those two next year. But we have, let's see, 9G. Within 9G, that we're talking about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is going to make it to where, it's that that desegregation of restaurants and things and schools and things like that. You can't be denied your job based on race. Of course, there's going to be other things that are going to come into play that are going to make it very difficult to get these things, actually working. And then we have the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which makes it illegal to require literacy exams and stuff like that to stop people from voting. This is where 9B comes into play because it explains how Jim Crow laws, which is what's going to make it difficult to implement the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, but also the Ku Klux Klan, which we've talked a little bit about up to this point, especially I know some of y'all focused on them in the 1920s, and so we will get back into them. How are they making voting difficult? What is voter suppression with regard to the KKK? Now we have 9A, trace the historical development of the civil rights movement from the late 1800s to the 21st century, including the 13th, 14th, 15th, and 19th Amendments. So we're going to get into the fact that why are we still dealing with this, right? This technically should have been taken care of back when the, post-Reconstruction 13th through 15th Amendment was passed. Women should not be dealing with the issues that they're dealing with right now, with all the strides. Also, really interesting to mention that women's rights generally take longer to take place. So historically, all the other minority groupings tend to see a lot of traction with regard to their protesting and stuff like that. They see a lot of movement, positive movement. With regard to the women's movement, it is a very, very slow. There's usually about 10 years gap between each major movement in the women's movement. So just an interesting little tidbit to mention. From this point on, you will start to see these major groupings, like I said, global, domestic, media, people, and tech. But of course, the global is not really a thing during the civil rights because we're mainly dealing with the United States here. So 9I, evaluate changes in the United States that have resulted from the civil rights movement, including increased participation of minorities in the political process. That's definitely tied to the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and all of the protesting that is going to be taking place, which is your nonviolent and your violent protesting that you will be talking to them about, which is mentioned in 22A. Identify and analyze methods of expanding the right to participate in the democratic process, including lobbying, nonviolent protesting, litigation, and amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Now, it doesn't mention the violent protesting, but you are going to talk about Malcolm X and the Black Panthers and their concept of kind of eye for an eye, meet violence with violence. And so that is a type of violent protesting. And it's the polar to nonviolent, which is such a great lesson. Most people will do one full lesson and compare and contrast Malcolm X and MLK. And I think it's such a great lesson to do because it really shows the different ways to go about the same problem and why people thought the way that they did. Also really interesting that towards the end of MLK's life, he started to kind of agree with Malcolm X, and Malcolm X actually started to agree with MLK. So they were starting to switch on their, concepts. I think MLK was getting tired of fighting the good fight. And I think Malcolm X was seeing that maybe the violence was getting worse on their end. And they were starting to, kind of find a better meeting ground here. But they really are the the difference of opinions, because you have the Christian pastor, nonviolent, protester, educated. You also had Malcolm X, who was of Islam. He was Muslim faith, and he did not come up from a wealthy family, but he was educated, and he was the meet violence with violence, and so they were really the opposite of each other. Very, very interesting. Also interesting to note that American society needed both, right? It wasn't really one or the other. You needed both. You needed a Malcolm X safe type for white America, and then you needed a Malcolm X protective type for Black America to come together, but to really hash this problem out and really get it into the forefront and get it into Congress and start to see some real legislation happen in order to fix these issues. And let's see, we have 22C, explain how the contributions of people of various racial, ethnic, gender, and religious groups shape American culture. And of course, I just talked about differences just simply between MLK and Malcolm X, but you will continue to do that because some of your following TEKS are going to focus on the differences of the different groupings that we'll be dealing with the civil rights movement. 20A, analyze the effects of landmark U.S. Supreme Court decisions, including Plessy v. Ferguson, which you should have already taught, Brown v. Board of Education, Hernandez v. Texas, and Wisconsin v. Yoder. Okay, so when we look at these Supreme Court decisions, Plessy v. Ferguson is, of course, separate but equal, but if it's separate, it's never equal. And so we have Brown v. Board, which is that is your case where I said the Earl Warren is going to be your guy. That's the one where I said that Earl Warren, that is going to be your Chief Warren. He is going to be the Chief Justice on the case, but you will have Thurgood Marshall, who will eventually be a Supreme Court judge, but he is actually going to be a lawyer on the Brown v. Board case, and that I have seen that question before, so please keep that in mind. Brown versus Board of Education is going to make it's going to get rid of the separate but equal. It is going to make integration in schools happen. Segregation will not be allowed, and then of course, we will have what you'll talk about a little later, which is the integration of Little Rock. And when this takes place, now we're all the way back to Eisenhower when this happens, okay? And again, there's that timeline. But we are back to President Eisenhower because he is going to get the military involved. He is going to force integration into Little Rock High School for the Little Rock Nine. Because of Brown v. Board, they're going to try and push it from happening. That will be Orville Faubus, who is going to be the governor of Arkansas, and he's going to try and make it not happen. And he's actually going to shut down school over this and everything. They'll have cops that'll come up. We'll also have Ruby Bridges, who will be the little girl. She is 6 years old, going to go to school. She's going to experience quite a bit trying to get in there. They'll have cops walking her in. There's a historical photo of her in her little dress and cute little Mary Jane shoes trying to go into school. And what she's going to be met with are people who have baby dolls in caskets and yelling, and because they don't want the integration. This one's going to take place in Louisiana. Now, these are important things to mention. Also, like freedom rides, where they're going to be riding buses into towns to make sure that the Civil Rights Act is actually focused on, that integration is actually happening, that people are being allowed to vote and things like that. So even though it may not be specifically mentioned in the TEK, it technically is. This is one of those units that they don't, it's kind of vague. They don't mention everything. You just have to know the history. You have to know everything that's tied into it, and yet teach it in a very short unit to the point where they know it. This is the hardest unit to teach for teachers. And so I want to be very focused when or very firm and blunt when I say you have to teach it, okay? So you got to go in, and you can't be scared to teach civil rights. You just can't take a stand. You've got to allow the students to get to that concept of why these things are needed, and why all of what was going on at the time was an issue, and why we needed these reforms and stuff with regard to segregating schools, and also something maybe interesting to mention, that it wasn't but a couple years ago that the last school was actually integrated. So we still had segregated schools up until a couple of years ago, and that one in particular was in Mississippi. So, these are not things that were necessarily fixed at this point in time. We still had quite a bit of movement. to get to where we were trying to get to. It is a difficult unit. It is a charged unit. And so, of course, stick to your TEKS, but also you have got to teach everything with regard to the subject. So what you've got to focus on is like evaluate changes in the United States that have resulted from the civil rights movement, right? So the fact that it says anything later and it says including is things that they really want you to focus on. But that doesn't mean that that's the only thing you focus on. You've got to find the things that tie in to that really broad subject when it comes to the civil rights time frame. Okay, so let's move on. We were on 20A. We talked about Brown v. Board and Plessy v. Ferguson. You're also going to have Hernandez v. Texas. This is a very, very important case. Okay, so Hernandez v. Texas is an exceptionally important case because it does two things. At first, you have got to be given a jury of your peers. Okay, that's one of your amendments. So like anytime that you get into these cases, you really need to bring up the major amendments that are used to back the ruling that is made. So here, Hernandez v. Texas, you have to have a jury of your peers. Well, Hernandez was given a jury of nothing but white peers. At the time, Hispanics were considered white. That's how they were listed. So if you've got somebody of Hispanic origin who they've been given all white peers, does the white jury truly understand what a Hispanic person has experienced with regard to their time in the United States, if they're new, or just what they've experienced in general, because there was a lot of discrimination going on against the Hispanic community at this time. And really historically. So the argument was that he did not have a jury of his peers because even though legally white people were considered grouped with Hispanics are grouped into white, like if you know how you fill out the census and you check your race and your ethnicity. So here they would have checked white. So the argument is that they weren't given a jury of their peers. So this case is going to do two things. This amendment is going to achieve two things. It is going to rule that he wasn't given a jury of his peers, and it is now going to create a division between being of Hispanic origin and being white. So that is why now when you look at the census, you can check two different things. You can check that you are your race, which would be Hispanic or of Latin origin, and then you will check white. So it separates the two. Before it was just white. So this is a really important case for multiple reasons, and it is quite tested. Wisconsin v. Yoder is going to be your case. It is a religious case, and it is over the ability to exercise your beliefs. So Wisconsin v. Yoder is Amish against the school system. Should kids be required to go to high school? In the Amish community, after middle school, they should be able to come home. They're adults and tend to the community's needs. And so this is going to go to the Supreme Court. They are going to rule in favor of the Amish community because that is exercising their religious beliefs, that after that age, they're adults and then they can start their adult life, come ninth grade. So we'll move on to two that are not explicitly mentioned, but they are tested. Again, another one, right? Why not just tell us all the ones that you plan on testing? But it's so that I guess teachers get used to expanding into other areas with the little units that they have to do so. So we've got Miranda v. Arizona, which is being made known your rights. Why is it so important to be made known your rights? Because not every U.S. citizen knows their rights. And some rights do apply to people who are not United States citizens. So it is important that somebody knows that they have the right to be quiet. Also consider the fact that if you are a United States citizen, but you don't speak English, then when somebody comes up and is telling you that you've got to do all these things and you're afraid and you say things that maybe you say something that isn't correct English and it can be used against you. And that's not what you meant. Your words can be misconstrued because you don't know the English language very well. There's if you don't know that you have the right to be quiet and you are compelled to speak or to give up, to confess to a crime you didn't commit, you are compelled to do it, and you don't know that you don't have the right to ask for a lawyer who can help you, then you are at a disadvantage to the system. And so that is why Miranda v. Arizona is important. Escobedo v. Illinois is, Escobedo is going to be interrogated and he is going to request a lawyer during the interrogation and they are going to refuse it to him. So Escobedo v. Illinois is going to say that if you request a lawyer, you are required to be given one. Okay, so these are obviously important, but they are not mentioned. So do keep them in mind. That was, let's see, 22A. We have 25A, explain actions taken by people to expand economic opportunities, political rights for racial, ethnic, gender, and religious groups in American society. We have 25C, explain how contributions of various racial and ethnic Wait, are we on that one? Yeah. Gender and religious groups shape America. 1A and 1B, again, which is analyze the Constitution, TEKS, Bill of Rights, Declaration of Independence, and then the historical events in U.S. history, applying those to that. 9J is going to be Sweat v. Painter and Brown v. Board, playing a role in protecting the rights of the minorities during the civil rights movement. Sweat v. Painter is an interesting case. This is going to be an African-American man who is trying to get into the University of Texas law, and he's going to be not denied based on his race. And so pretty much he is going to take this to court, and they are going to have to require him admission. They cannot deny admission to college based on race. So that is Sweat v. Painter, and that's why they have joined these two together, because they are playing a role in the education sector, which is really where we're going to see kind of the movement up for minority groups to raise up in American society. It's through education. And then we will have 20B, which is explain why landmark constitutional amendments have been proposed and ratified from 1877 to the present. All right, your next major TEK is going to be 9C. Describe the roles of political organizations that promote African American, Chicano, American Indian, and women's civil rights. Okay, those are a lot of groups. And so I always taught this through thematic groupings of minority groups. So I'd just be like, today and tomorrow are your minority group days. And we would focus on the minority group, what they stood for. Then we would focus on 9D, which is grouped into 9C, which is the leaders who were a part of it. And so that's kind of how I focused it. And I feel like thematic teaching of civil rights makes more sense to me. But 9D, identify the role of significant leaders who supported various rights movements, including MLK, Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, Rosa Parks, and Betty Friedan. And those are going to be your major people that you're really focusing on for these groups. Like the Little Rock Nine is a major group, though. Ruby Bridges is a major person. So also consider that there's other people. Later on, there's Thurgood Marshall. There's George Wallace, Orville Faubus, the Congressional Bloc. There's Southern Democrats. There's also the Southern Christian Conference. So like these are other groups that you would be focusing on when you're talking about these particular people and minority groupings. Okay, so let's go into 2B, explain the significance of the following years. Turning points, 1968. That's MLK's assassination. I also would talk about Malcolm X's assassination also. 9E, compare and contrast the approach taken by Black Panthers with the nonviolent approach of MLK. So then again, like I said, you're going to be comparing these two. 9F, discuss the I Have a Dream and Letter from Birmingham Jail. 9, I would always sign I Have a Dream, because I also brought in the deaf community because there's a lot of civil rights issues going on with them. And I would bring in the disabled community because that is going to become a topic in the 1970s through that 1991 timeframe as well. 9H is George Wallace, Orville Faubus, and Congressional Bloc of Southern Democrats seeking to keep the status quo, keep the segregation and the discriminatory policies and racism that is taking place during this time frame. 23A is evaluate the contributions of Thurgood Marshall. Right now, you're starting with the fact that Thurgood Marshall is a lawyer on Brown v. Board, but you will follow up with that he becomes a Supreme Court judge. And then 25D, identify the contributions of women such as Rosa Parks. What you really want to talk about Rosa Parks is the Montgomery bus boycott. You're going to focus on that because it's a form of protest, but you also need to focus on Betty Friedan and her book. And she is going to be really your main female focus when it comes to women's rights at this time frame. Your last one I have is 17D, identify the actions and outcomes of government policies intended to create economic opportunities for citizens, such as the Great Society, affirmative action, and Title IX. Whew. Oh my goodness. So when you're focusing on these two things, I had separated it because they're further down the road. But you could technically group these in groupings. So what I would say, the way that I would do it is I would take the groups. So African American, and then I would take every part of the TEKS that I said, and I would fit them, the ones that fit into African American, there's one group, okay? And I would do this for every single group that I planned on teaching on with regard to civil rights. And then I would take days, set aside a block of days. This normally took about 3 days because you have a lot of groups. And then I added 2 others, I believe. So I had these other groups also that I wanted to hit on. And so in order for them to have, let's see, that was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I had about 7 groupings. And so 3 days would give them time to go through about 3 a day, and then on that last day hit the last 2, and then cover anything else that they may not have. And this gave me time to add all of these things into the group so they can focus it all together, not learn it separately, learn it together. So they would be learning about the African American civil rights with MLK and Malcolm X and the Black Panthers, nonviolent versus violent protesting, the I Have a Dream and the letters from Birmingham jail. They could learn about George Wallace and Orville Faubus and the Congressional Bloc all at the same time, along with the Christian Southern Christian Conference and Sweat v. Painter. Like, they could do all of these things at the same time, and I could hit them all, along with, affirmative action, which kind of more so ties into African American rights. But they could do it all together, and that was a huge chunk. And some students might only get through African American in one day, right? And then kind of move the other ones because there was less information in the other ones that they would have to get to. But this made it a lot easier. When I got to Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, I would get into the Farm Workers of America and really focus this group. And then I could also kind of add in the LA school walkouts. I could add in the Chicano movement and tie it back to the 1920s Mexican muralism and bring in the Chicano movement with their muralism and everything that's taking place kind of over in that California, LA to San Diego, San Francisco area, and really focus on them. But if you notice, that's a lot smaller here than that African American part, right? And then I could focus on Betty Friedan and that women's movement, Title IX and stuff like that. I could focus on my Deaf President Now and my deaf group and the disabilities group and the Disability Act, the ADA that will take place. And so I could really get into everything here in a very easy way that didn't take a lot of time. So please consider doing groupings like that. You can do it with stations. You can do it in your Nearpods by creating a Nearpod per group. You can really find a great way to do this and really get all the groups taken care of, all the information taken care of without getting bogged down, because this is the unit that will bog you down and you'll look up and be like, oh my gosh, I'm not done. I haven't even made it halfway through. So don't be that person. Pace yourself, focus on how you're going to do it. And I really do suggest thematically in minority groupings. And that is it. That is it for civil rights. That was a lot though. I'm not going to say that's an easy unit. That's a hard unit. It is easy to get bogged down on. You have to be super paced and organized, and you need to figure out a way to teach it. If you're going to do it thematically, which is how I suggest, that's great. If not, if you're going to do a timeline and teach it as it happened, it's much harder to do. But you're going to have to get started on that early. So